A routine flight from Chicago to San Francisco becomes the stage for a shocking act of discrimination. When a demanding passenger insists a 9-year-old black child give up her prepaid window seat, the flight crew sides with the aggressor. They pressure the child and her aunt to move, citing convenience and the need for a timely departure. But they made one catastrophic mistake. They never asked for the little girl's name. What they are about to learn will not only cost them their jobs, but will send a seismic shockwave through the entire airline industry, proving that sometimes karma doesn't just knock on the door, it deplanes you. The air in Chicago O'Hare's Terminal 1 was a familiar symphony of chaos, a frantic orchestra of rolling suitcases, garbled boarding announcements, and the low, anxious hum of thousands of intersecting journeys. For Dr. Lavenia Washington, it was just background noise. Her focus was singular, resting on the small hand tucked securely in hers. "Are you excited, sweet pea?" Lavinia asked, her voice a warm, low counterpoint to the airport's din. 9-year-old Zadeh looked up, her large, intelligent brown eyes reflecting the fluorescent lights above. A small, thoughtful frown creased her brow. "I'm excited to see Grandma and Grandpa, and the ocean, but I don't like the takeoff part. It feels like my tummy is trying to escape through my ears." Lavinia chuckled, squeezing her hand. "I know the feeling. But think of it this way, for a few minutes of a funny tummy feeling, you get to soar above the clouds like a superhero, and I made sure you have the best seat in the house to watch it all happen. This was a special trip." Lavenia, a pediatric cardiologist with a demanding schedule, had carved out 10 precious days to take her niece from their home in Chicago to visit her parents in Sausalito, just across the Golden Gate Bridge from San Francisco. Zaid's father, Lavenia's brother-in-law, Jonathan, was consumed by a corporate merger in New York and couldn't get away. He had entrusted Lavenia with his most precious cargo. It was a trust she took as seriously as any open-heart surgery. Months in advance, Lavenia had booked their tickets on Eurowings Flight 715. Knowing Zadeh's love for the window, she had meticulously selected their seats 12A and 12B. A window for Zadeh, an aisle for her. Perfect. She'd paid the extra fee without a second thought. The small joys were the most important. Boarding for Eurowings. Flight 7 or 15 to San Francisco will now begin with our first class and diamond tier passengers. Lavinia gathered their things. Zaid's small backpack decorated with planets and stars, and her own leather tote bag. They were in boarding group 2, so the wait wasn't long. Soon they were shuffling down the jet bridge, the scent of filtered air and jet fuel replacing the terminal's popcorn and perfume smell. Inside the cabin, Lavenia guided Zadeh toward their row. "Here we are, sweet pea." Row 12. Zaid's face lit up as she saw the small, thick window. She scrambled past Lavenia and buckled herself into seat 12A, immediately pressing her face to the cool acrylic, her breath fogging a small circle. She began pointing out the ground crew, the baggage carts moving like busy ants, the hulking shapes of other planes. This was her world now, a tiny portal to a grand adventure. Lavenia smiled, stowing their bags in the overhead bin before settling into her aisle seat 12B. She pulled out her tablet and a medical journal, but her attention remained on the radiant joy emanating from the small girl beside her. This was what mattered, this peace, this happiness. The peace was shattered by a sharp, imperious voice. "Excuse me, I think you're in our seats." Lavinia looked up. A woman stood in the aisle, impeccably dressed in a beige pantsuit that looked far too expensive for commercial air travel. Her blonde hair was coiffed into a severe, unmoving helmet. Her face was a mask of practiced impatience. Beside her, a boy of about 10, clutching a tablet, mirrored his mother's expression of disdain. Lavenia offered a polite professional smile, the one she used with anxious parents before explaining a complex diagnosis. "I don't believe so. We're in 12A and 12B. She gestured to their boarding passes, which she'd tucked into the seat back pocket. The woman whose name Lavenia would later learn was Carol Becca didn't glance at them. Her eyes were fixed on Zadeh, then on the window, as if the child were a temporary obstruction. "My son Kevin always sits at the window," she stated, not as a request, but as an announcement of an unchangeable fact of the universe. "His father is a diamond tier member. We booked a window seat." I'm sure you did, Lavinia, replied her voice still even. But this particular window seat, 12NI, was booked by me. Perhaps your seats are across the aisle or in another row. Carol Becker's lips thinned into a razor line. No, I booked a window and an aisle in this section. My son needs the window. He gets anxious otherwise. Kevin, the supposedly anxious son, let out an impatient sigh. Mom, just make her move. I want to see the wing. The crudeness of the boy's demand sent a small spark of anger through Lavinia's calm exterior. She looked from the mother's entitled glare to the boy's petulant frown. She recognized the pathology instantly, a severe case of unbridled privilege. I'm sorry your son is anxious, Lavinia said, her tone hardening slightly. But this is our seat. We paid for it and Zadeh is quite comfortable where she is. Zadeh, sensing the tension, had pulled back from the window. She was no longer watching the ground crew. She was watching the confrontation, her small shoulders tensing. She looked at Lavinia, a question in her eyes. Carol Becker scoffed, a short, sharp sound of disbelief. It's a child. She can sit in the aisle. What's the difference? It would be so much easier if you would just cooperate. We don't want to hold up the entire flight over a silly chair, do we? The phrase, it would be easier, was a red flag for Lavinia. It was the language of bullies and bureaucrats, the justification for taking the path of least resistance, which was so often the path of least justice. The difference, Lavinia, said her voice, now dangerously quiet, is that I chose this seat for my niece. She is happy in this seat, and we will be remaining in this seat. I'm sure a flight attendant can help you find your assigned seats. With that, she turned slightly away, a clear dismissal. It was a move that in a hospital boardroom or a medical conference would have ended the conversation. But this was not a boardroom. Carol Becker's face flushed a blotchy red. She wasn't used to being denied. She took a deep breath and her voice rose several dB sharp enough to cut through the cabin chatter. Flight attendant, she called out, her voice dripping with indignation. Flight attendant, there's a problem here. This woman is refusing to move from our seat. Heads turned, the low hum of boarding passengers quieted in their immediate vicinity. A flight attendant with a tight, weary expression and a name tag that read, Susan, bustled over her face, already a mask of practiced problem-solving. What seems to be the trouble here, Mom? She asked, directing the question solely to Carol Becker. Lavinia watched a cold knot forming in her stomach. Susan hadn't even looked at her or Zadie. The battle lines were being drawn, and the airline's representative had already chosen a side. The storm that had been gathering at the gate was about to break right here in the narrow confines of row 12. Susan, the flight attendant, possessed the harried energy of someone who had already dealt with 3 delays and a lost catering cart before this flight had even boarded. She listened with a sympathetic, nodding expression as Carol Becker laid out her grievances. Her voice a carefully curated blend of victimhood and authority. And I explained that my son needs the window. He's a nervous flyer, Carol embellished, gesturing toward Kevin, who was now engrossed in his tablet game, looking anything but nervous. I am a platinum member, and my husband is diamond. We have a certain expectation of service. This woman, she said, waving a dismissive hand toward Lavinia, is being utterly unreasonable. She's making a scene. Lavinia remained silent, letting the absurdity of the accusation hang in the air. She was the one sitting calmly while Carol was the one shouting for an attendant. But Susan's eyes, when they finally turned to Lavinia, were not questioning. They were pleading. Mom Susan began, her voice strained with forced politeness. We do need to get the flight out on time. For the sake of a smooth departure, would it be possible for the little girl to switch to the aisle seat? It's just 1 seat over. The framing of the request was insidious. It positioned Lavinia as the obstacle, the source of the delay, the unreasonable one. It completely ignored the fact that they were in their rightfully assigned seats. With all due respect, Lavinia replied, her voice low and firm. That's not a solution. We selected and paid for seat 12A. My niece is settled. I see no reason why we should be the ones to move. She met Susan's gaze directly. Could you please help Mrs. Becker find her assigned seat so we can all get settled? Susan's face tightened. This was not the quick, easy capitulation she was hoping for. She glanced at Carol, then back at Lavinia, Her internal calculus was painfully obvious. On one side was an angry, high-status, frequent flyer, likely to file a lengthy, vitriolic complaint. On the other was a quiet black woman with a child. In the biased arithmetic of conflict avoidance, Lavinia and Zadeh were the easier problem to solve. "Mom, I understand, but sometimes there are seating duplications in the system." Susan fabricated her voice, taking on a patronizing, explanatory tone. "The simplest way to resolve this right now is to just make a small switch. We can't have this discussion holding up the entire plane." Zaid, who had been trying to make herself as small as possible, whispered, "Auntie Lavinia, it's okay. I can move." Her voice was a tiny, heartbreaking squeak of concession. Hearing that whisper, that willingness to surrender her own happiness to make the conflict go away, ignited a fiercely protective fire in Lavinia's chest. This was no longer about a window seat. It was about teaching her niece that she had a right to take up space in the world, a right to what was hers, and that she should never ever have to shrink herself to accommodate the unreasonable demands of others. "No, sweet pea," Lavinia said softly, putting a reassuring hand on Zadeh's arm. Then she looked back at Susan, her resolve hardening into granite. "There is no system duplication. I have our confirmations right here. The issue is that this passenger wants something that doesn't belong to her. As an airline employee, your role should be to enforce the rules, not to ask rule-abiding passengers to inconvenience themselves for those who are breaking them." The directness of the challenge left Susan flustered. Her professional veneer cracked. "Ma'am, I am trying to de-escalate the situation. This situation was created by one person and is being escalated by you," Lavinia corrected calmly. "Asking us to move is not de-escalation, it's capitulation." Carol Becker, seeing her advantage slipping, interjected loudly. "This is ridiculous. I have never been treated this way. Are you going to do something or not?" The pressure mounted. Other passengers were now openly staring. A man in the row behind them grumbled, "For God's sake, just move so we can leave." Another passenger across the aisle was filming the interaction on her phone. Susan's face was now pale with stress and anger. She saw the phone and knew this could become a viral incident. She made a decision. She leaned in closer to Lavinia, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial but threatening whisper. "Mom, I am now making a request as a member of the flight crew for you to switch seats to ensure the timely departure of this aircraft. If you refuse to comply with a flight crew instruction, I will have to get the purser. We can have you removed from the flight for non-compliance." It was the nuclear option, a blatant, dishonest twisting of FAA regulations, which were designed to ensure safety, not to settle seating squabbles. Lavinia knew it was an empty threat, a procedural bluff, but it was a threat nonetheless. The implication was clear. Surrender or we will publicly humiliate you and your niece and ruin your trip entirely. Lavinia looked at Zadeh. The little girl's eyes were wide with fear. The joy of the trip had evaporated, replaced by a tense, terrifying adult conflict she didn't understand, but knew was centered on her. She saw the staring faces of the other passengers, heard the man grumbling behind them. She saw the anger in Carol Becker's face and the brittle authority in the flight attendants. In that instant, Lavinia's calculation changed. The battle for the seat was lost. Winning it now would require an argument so explosive it would deeply traumatize Zadeh. Her primary mission always was to protect her niece, protect her from the ugliness of the world. And right now, that meant getting her out of the spotlight. The fight for justice could happen later, but the fight for Zadeh's sense of security had to be won now. A cold, controlled fury settled over Lavinia. She would comply with the illegitimate demand, but she would not forget. She would not forgive. This was no longer a dispute. It was an incident, and there would be a reckoning. "Fine," Lavinia said, her voice devoid of all warmth. "We will move." Susan's shoulders sagged with relief. Carol Becker's lips twisted into a smug, triumphant smirk. "See?" Carol said to no one in particular. "Was that so hard?" Lavinia ignored her completely. She turned to her niece, her own face, a mask of serene calm to hide the inferno raging within. "Okay, sweet pea, let's play musical chairs. You come sit here with me on the aisle." Zadeh, her lower lip trembling, unbuckled her seatbelt and slid out of 12A. As she did, Kevin pushed past her without a word of thanks, and threw himself into the window seat, immediately gluing his face to the window, oblivious to the small girl he had just displaced. As Zade buckled herself into 12B, the aisle seat, she leaned into her aunt. Her voice was so quiet, Lavinia could barely hear it over the restarting cabin announcements. Auntie Lavinia. Yes, sweet pea. Why did we have to move? Was it because I'm brown? The question struck Lavinia with the force of a physical blow. It was the question she had been dreading, the poison dart of racism finding its mark in the heart of a child. She pulled Zade closer, her arm wrapping around her niece's shaking shoulders. She had protected her from the scene, but she couldn't protect her from the meaning behind it. Not entirely, no, baby. She lied the word, tasting like ash in her mouth. It's because some people are rude. It has nothing to do with you. You are perfect. But as she looked past Zade at the triumphant smirk on Carol Becker's face and the retreating back of Susan, she knew Zade's innocent question was closer to the truth than her own comforting lie. And the quiet, cold fury within her began to crystallize into a plan. The flight had barely begun, but for Susan and Carol Becker, the final descent had already been initiated. The plane taxied, took off, and climbed to its cruising altitude of 35,000 ft. Below them, the sprawling grid of Chicago gave way to the patchwork quilt of Middle America. But Zade didn't see any of it. She was closed off, huddled in the aisle seat, her tablet lying untouched in her lap. The magic was gone. Lavinia's heart ached for her. She had tried to engage her in conversation, offered her snacks, pointed out the drink cart, but Zade's responses were listless and monosyllabic. The vibrant, curious girl from the boarding gate had been replaced by a shadow. Meanwhile, in seat 12A, Kevin was a constant, irritating presence, loudly pointing things out to his mother and occasionally knocking his elbow into Zade as he shifted around for a better view. Carol Becker, for her part, was absorbed in a fashion magazine, exuding an aura of smug satisfaction. She had won. She had gotten her way. To her, the matter was closed. For Lavinia, it was just beginning. Her mind, trained to be methodical and precise in the high-stakes environment of cardiac surgery, was now working with the same cool detachment. Emotion was the fuel, but logic would be the weapon. She was no longer just an aunt on vacation. She was an observer, a chronicler of an injustice. About an hour into the flight, Susan came by with the beverage service. When she reached their row, she adopted a tone of bright, artificial cheerfulness. "And what can I get for you two today?" she asked pointedly, avoiding Lavinia's eyes and smiling only at Zade. "I'll have a ginger ale, please," Lavinia said, her voice neutral. "Zade? Nothing, thank you," Zade mumbled. "Oh, of course she wants something." Carol Becker chimed in from the other side of Kevin, not even looking up from her magazine. "Kids always want soda. Get her a Sprite." Lavinia's gaze snapped to Carol, then to Susan. "She said she doesn't want anything. My niece is perfectly capable of speaking for herself." Susan, caught in the crossfire again, quickly poured Lavinia's ginger ale and moved on, flustered. The incident, though small, was another piece of evidence. The dismissal, the assumption, the utter disregard for Zade as a person with her own voice. Lavinia took a sip of her drink and waited. She needed to speak with someone in charge, but not yet. She needed the right moment, a time when the crew was less busy and she could have a more formal, uninterrupted conversation. She saw Susan speaking with an older, more senior-looking male flight attendant near the galley. He had a weary but authoritative air about him. The person, she surmised, his name tag, she noted from a distance, read, Frank. She waited another 30 minutes until the service was complete, and the cabin had settled into the quiet hum of the mid-flight lull. She unbuckled her seatbelt. "I'll be right back, sweet pea," she whispered to Zade, who just nodded. Lavinia walked calmly to the forward galley. Susan and Frank were there restocking the carts. Susan's eyes widened in alarm when she saw Lavinia approaching. "Is there a problem?" Frank asked, his tone professionally neutral, but his eyes wary. He had clearly been briefed on the earlier incident. "Yes, I believe there is," Lavinia said calmly. She wasn't here to argue or vent. She was here to collect information. "I am a passenger on this flight, and I need to file a formal complaint regarding an incident that occurred during boarding. For that complaint, I will need the full name and employee number of the flight attendant who handled the situation in row 12. She looked directly at Susan. Susan palled. This was not a passenger who was going to forget about it by the time they landed. This was something else. Frank stepped forward, adopting the role of the managerial gatekeeper. Mom, perhaps you can explain the situation to me, and I can handle it. I'm sure you can, Lavinia replied, her voice unwavering. And after I explain it to you, I will still require her name and employee number, and yours as well. Frank's professional mask tightened. This was highly unusual. My name is Frank Miller, and this is Susan Peters. Our employee numbers are not typically given out to passengers. I see, Lavinia said, pulling a pen and a small notebook from her pocket. She calmly wrote down their names. Then I will include in my report that Purser Frank Miller and flight attendant Susan Peters refused to provide their employee identification when requested in relation to a formal passenger complaint. Is that the official position you'd like me to record? The word record had a chilling effect. This wasn't a verbal tiff anymore. This was documentation, evidence. Frank and Susan exchanged a panicked glance. They were trained to write reports about unruly passengers, not to be the subjects of them. Frank sighed, his shoulders slumping. This flight was becoming a nightmare. He recited his employee number, and a reluctant Susan did the same. Lavinia wrote them down meticulously. Thank you, she said. Now regarding the incident, I would like to formally state that my 9-year-old niece and I were intimidated and coerced by Ms. Peters into giving up our pre-selected prepaid seats under the threat of being removed from the flight. Now wait a minute, Susan interjected, her voice rising. I never threatened you. You told me that if I did not comply with a crew instruction to move, you would have me removed for non-compliance. Lavinia stated, her voice as flat and steady as a heart monitor. That is a threat. It was a gross mislication of your authority to resolve a seating dispute that you failed to mediate impartially. Frank held up a hand to silence Susan. He tried a different tactic. Appeasement. Mom, Ms. Washington, is it? He asked, glancing at a passenger manifest on a screen in the galley. Dr. Washington, Lavinia corrected quietly. My apologies. Dr. Washington, I understand you're upset. On behalf of the crew, I apologize for any misunderstanding. These seating issues can be very tense. As a gesture of goodwill, I would be happy to offer you and your niece drink vouchers and a credit for future travel with Aura Wings. It was a standard textbook offer, a small payment to make a big problem go away. For many passengers, it would have been enough, but Lavinia wasn't many passengers. Mr. Miller. I am not interested in drink vouchers, she said, her voice dropping to an icy calm. A credit to fly on an airline that allows its staff to bully a child is not a gesture of goodwill. It's an insult. What I am interested in is accountability. I want to ensure that what happened to my niece today never happens to another child on one of your flights. The finality in her tone left no room for negotiation. Frank was out of his depth. He was used to dealing with angry passengers, drunk passengers, even frightened passengers. He had never dealt with a passenger who was so calm, so precise, and so utterly immovable. She wasn't emotional. She was methodical. It was terrifying. I will certainly file a full report on this, Dr. Washington, he stammered. I will need your full name and the name of your niece for the report, of course. Of course, Lavinia said. She watched him, her gaze intense. This was the moment, the key turning in the lock. My name is Dr. Lavinia Washington. She paused, letting the name settle. Then she delivered the payload. And my niece, the child who was forced to move from her seat, is Zade. She let the silence hang in the small galley for a beat, making sure she had Frank's and Susan's full, undivided attention. Her last name is Davenport. Davenport. The name didn't land like a stone in the small galley. It landed like a lightning strike. It was a name the crew of Aura Wings knew as intimately as they knew their own. It was on their paychecks. It was on the letterhead of every corporate memo. It was on the gold-embossed plaque on the wall of the training center. It was the name of the founder's family and, more importantly, the name of the current hands-on and notoriously exacting CEO, Jonathan Davenport. For a long second, there was no sound at all, but the distant hum of the engines. Frank Miller's face, which had been a mask of professional concern, seemed to crumble. The blood drained from it, leaving a pasty grayish pallor. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He looked as if he'd been electrocuted. Susan Peters' reaction was even more dramatic. A small, horrified gasp escaped her lips, and her hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes, wide with sheer, unadulterated terror, darted from Lavenia's unblinking gaze to the passenger manifest on the screen, as if desperately hoping the computer would tell her this was all a terrible mistake. But there it would be in stark black and white. Z. Davenport. The implications crashed down on them in a devastating tidal wave. They hadn't just inconvenienced a passenger. They hadn't just sided with a bully in a seating dispute. They had, through a toxic combination of bias, poor judgment, and procedural abuse, actively discriminated against and distressed the daughter of the man who owned the entire airline. Davenport Frank finally managed to whisper the name cracking in his dry throat. As in, Jonathan Davenport Lavenia didn't need to answer. Her steady, unwavering silence was more damning than any confirmation. She simply stood there, a silent executioner, letting the full weight of their catastrophic error settle upon them. The quiet, methodical woman they had dismissed and tried to plate with drink vouchers was suddenly transformed. In their eyes, she was no longer just a passenger. She was a direct link to the highest echelons of power, an emissary of the man who held their careers, their very livelihoods in the palm of his hand. Susan began to stammer words, tripping over themselves in a frantic, desperate rush. Oh my God, I didn't know. I had no idea. If I had known. Mom, Dr. Washington, I am so sorry. It was just, she was so insistent, and we were trying to get out on time. Her apology was a pathetic, transparent admission of the very thing Lavenia was fighting against, that a passenger's identity and status determined how they were treated. The name, not the principle, was what mattered. Lavenia cut her off with a single sharp look. So if she had been Zadie Smith, this would have been acceptable. The question hung in the air, a final brutal indictment of their actions. There was no right answer. Susan wilted her face, a mess of shame and fear. Frank, recovering slightly from the initial shock, snapped into a new mode damage control. But it was the frantic, panicked damage control of a man trying to patch a hole in the Hoover Dam with a piece of chewing gum. Dr. Washington, please let us fix this. Right now, we will move Mrs. Becca. We will move her to the back of the plane if we have to. We can move you and Zadie up to first class. There are 2 seats available. Please allow us to correct this immediately. His voice was pleading, desperate. He was no longer trying to solve a customer service issue. He was trying to save his and Susan's jobs. Move us to first class. Lavenia repeated, her voice dangerously soft. So the solution to my niece being publicly removed from her economy cell class window seat is for her to be publicly moved again. You think the answer to this humiliation is a bigger seat and a warmer nut? No, Mr. Miller. The time for fixing it on this airplane passed the moment Miss Peters threatened to have me removed from the flight. We will be staying in seats 12B and 12C for the remainder of the journey. Her refusal was more terrifying to them than any screaming match would have been. By refusing their frantic offers, she was refusing to let them off the hook. She was signaling that this issue would not be resolved at 35,000 ft. It would be handled on the ground, by whom they could only imagine with sickening dread. I have to inform the captain. Frank mumbled, his mind clearly racing. He needed to get the ultimate authority on the aircraft involved. He practically fled the galley, scrambling toward the cockpit door as if escaping a fire. Susan was left alone with Lavenia. She looked utterly broken. Tears welled in her eyes. Please, she whispered. Dr. Washington, I have 2 kids, a mortgage. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. Please don't let this ruin my life. Lavenia looked at the woman, at her genuine terror, and felt a flicker of something. Not pity, but a profound sadness. This was the end result of a system of small compromises, of looking the other way, of choosing the easy path. Susan wasn't a monster. She was just a person who, when faced with a choice between right and easy, had chosen easy and had done so at the expense of a child. You should have thought of your kids when you were threatening to remove a 9-year-old from a flight, Lavenia said, her voice cold as the stratosphere outside the window. You should have thought of your mortgage when you decided that the comfort of a loud, entitled woman was more important than the dignity of a little girl. Your life is not my concern. My niece's well-being is. With that, Lavinia turned and walked back to her seat, leaving Susan alone in the galley, her face buried in her hands, the single word echoing in the small space. Davenport. When Lavinia returned to row 12, Zade looked up at her, her expression anxious. Is everything okay? Auntie Lavinia. Lavinia forced a reassuring smile. Everything is going to be just fine, sweet pea. She sat down, and the full weight of the confrontation settled on her. She felt a tremor of adrenaline, but also a deep, soul-crushing weariness. This shouldn't have had to happen. Up in the cockpit, Frank Miller was giving a frantic, abbreviated version of events to the flight's commander, Captain Miles. Captain Miles was a veteran pilot in his late 50s, a calm by the bookman who had seen almost everything in his 30 years of flying. But he had never seen this. Let me get this straight, Frank. Captain Miles, said his voice, a low rumble of disbelief over the cockpit's hum. You allowed a ferrying passenger, a child, to be intimidated out of her seat, and the child in question is Jonathan Davenport's daughter. I wasn't there for the initial confrontation, Captain Frank said defensively. Susan was handling it. By the time I got involved, she'd already threatened to deplane them. The captain rubbed his temples, a deep frown creasing his forehead. This was a disaster. Not just a customer service failure, but a brand-level career-ending catastrophe unfolding on his aircraft. He knew Jonathan Davenport by reputation, a brilliant, demanding, and fiercely private man, especially when it came to his only child. Okay, Captain Miles, said his decision-making process kicking into high gear. Here's what you do. Go back there. Apologize again to both of them, Dr. Washington and the girl. Don't make excuses. Just apologize. Offer them anything they want. Food, drinks, the controls to the airplane. I don't care. And for God's sake, keep Susan away from them. Tell her to handle service at the rear of the cabin for the rest of the flight. Frank nodded, relieved to have a direct order, and scurried out of the cockpit. A few minutes later, he reappeared at row 12. His entire demeanor had changed. He was no longer a manager. He was a supplicant. He knelt in the aisle, bringing himself down to eye level with Lavinia and Zade. Dr. Washington, on behalf of Captain Miles and the entire crew of this flight, I want to offer our most profound and sincere apologies for what occurred during boarding, he said, his voice thick with contrition. It was unacceptable, and there is no excuse for it. Zade, he said, turning to the little girl, his voice softening. I am so very sorry that we made you feel uncomfortable. That was our mistake, and we are deeply ashamed. Zade, startled by the sudden attention, and the man kneeling in the aisle just stared at him before looking to her aunt for guidance. Carol Becker, who had been listening with a perplexed expression, finally spoke up. What on earth is going on? Why are you apologizing to them? Frank shot her a look of pure venom, a flash of anger at the woman who had started this whole mess. Mom, I would strongly advise you to remain quiet for the rest of this flight. His tone was so sharp, so utterly devoid of customer service deference, that even Carol was momentarily stunned into silence. She had never been spoken to like that by airline staff. She sank back into her seat, a confused and angry frown on her face. She couldn't understand the sudden, dramatic shift in the power dynamic. Lavinia acknowledged Frank's apology with a curt nod. Thank you for the apology, Mr. Miller. I appreciate the captain's sentiment, but she offered nothing more. No absolution. No, it's okay. The rest of the flight was an exercise in surreal tension. The crew gave row 12 a wide berth, their movements tentative and fearful. Other passengers, sensing the shift in atmosphere, began whispering amongst themselves, stealing glances at the quiet black woman and child, who now seemed to be the most important people on the plane. Susan Peters was nowhere to be seen, having been effectively banished to the rear galley. Carol Becker stood in her seat, growing increasingly agitated. She kept looking at Lavinia and Zade, then at the Fing apologetic crew. The gears in her mind were turning. She had won the battle for the seat, but she had the distinct and terrifying feeling that she had just lost a war. She didn't even know she was fighting. She leaned over to her son, whispering, "What was that name?" he said. "The girl's last name." But Kevin just shrugged, already bored with the window and wanting his tablet back. As the plane began its initial descent into San Francisco, the seatbelt sign chimed on. Frank made his way back to row 12 one last time. "Dr. Washington," he said quietly, "Captain Miles has been in communication with our ground staff. There will be a reception for you at the gate to personally address this situation." Lavinia just nodded. She knew this wasn't going to be swept under the rug. Jonathan would not allow it. She looked at Zadi, who was finally showing a flicker of her old self, her eyes wide with anticipation of seeing her grandparents. "Look, sweet pea," Lavinia said, pointing past Kevin's head to the window. "You can see the bay." For the first time since the incident, Zadeh leaned forward to look. She saw the glittering expanse of the San Francisco Bay, the thin orange line of the Golden Gate Bridge in the distance. A small smile finally returned to her face. It was a smile of arrival, but for Frank Miller, Susan Peters, and the smug woman in seat 12A, it was the smile of Judgment Day. The touchdown at SFO was smooth, but the atmosphere inside the cabin was anything but. As the Aura Wing 737 taxied toward the gate, Captain Miles's voice came over the intercom. But it wasn't the standard cheerful welcome to San Francisco speech. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have just arrived at the gate. However, for operational reasons, we ask that you please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened until the seatbelt sign has been turned off. Ground personnel will be boarding the aircraft first. Thank you for your cooperation." A murmur of confusion rippled through the passengers. This was highly unusual. Most assumed it was a customs or security issue. Carol Becca huffed with annoyance, already reaching for her designer handbag from under the seat, ready to bolt the second the sign went off. Lavinia, however, knew exactly what operational reasons meant. She placed a calming hand on Zaid's shoulder. "We'll be out in just a few minutes, sweet pea." The jet bridge connected with a dull thud. The cabin door was opened, but instead of the usual stream of disembarking passengers, 3 figures stepped onto the plane. They were not gate agents. They were men in dark, impeccably tailored suits, their faces grim and serious. The first was Michael Chen, the airline's chief of airport operations for the entire West Coast. The second was David Finch, the vice president of in-flight experience, who had been pulled out of a board meeting. The third man walking behind them was taller, with a commanding presence that seemed to suck all the air out of the cabin. He was impeccably dressed, but his tie was slightly loosened, and his jaw was set like granite. It was Jonathan Davenport. Frank Miller and a visibly trembling Susan Peters met them at the door, their faces ashen. Jonathan Davenport didn't even look at them. His eyes, burning with a cold, controlled fury, scanned the cabin until they found row 12. He walked down the aisle, his footsteps silent but heavy. The whispering in the cabin died completely. Every passenger was now riveted. Sensing this was the heart of the drama, he stopped at their row. He ignored Carol Becca. He ignored the kneeling purser. His eyes, filled with a fierce paternal love, were only for his daughter. "Hey, Zoe," he said, his voice suddenly gentle, the hardness melting away. Daddy's face broke into a radiant smile of pure joy and surprise. She unbuckled her belt and practically launched herself into his arms as he crouched to embrace her. He held her tight for a long moment, burying his face in her hair. This was his world, his reason, and these people had hurt her. He looked over Zadi's head at Lavinia, his sister-in-law. His expression was one of immense gratitude and shared anger. "Lavinia, thank you. I got your text." Lavinia had sent him a brief factual message. Mid-flight incident on board. Zadea is safe but upset. Was forced to change seats. Crew involved. Will explain on landing. "Of course, Jonathan," she said quietly. He stood up, settling Zadeh gently on her feet, but keeping a protective hand on her shoulder. And then he turned. His gaze fell first upon Frank and Susan, who seemed to shrink under its intensity. He spoke, and his voice was not loud, but it was clear, cold, and carried the unmistakable weight of absolute authority. "Mr. Miller, Miss Peters," he said, having already been briefed on their names. "The core value of this airline, the only thing that separates us from our competitors, is a culture of respect. Respect for our customers, respect for our colleagues, and respect for ourselves. Today you have failed on all three counts. You did not respect a customer, a child no less. You did not respect your colleague, Captain Miles, by creating a major incident on his aircraft. And you certainly did not respect yourselves or the uniform you wear. He paused, letting the silence stretch. Hand your airline IDs to Mr. Chen. Your employment with Aurowings is terminated, effective immediately. A security detail will escort you to collect your personal items. You are not to set foot on one of my aircraft again. Susan let out a choked sob. Frank simply closed his eyes, his face a mask of utter defeat. It was over. Their careers gone in an instant. Then Jonathan Davenport's gaze shifted, landing squarely on Carol Becker. She had finally put the pieces together. The name, the arrival of the men in suits, the man who was clearly the CEO. Her face, which had been a mask of smug confusion, was now a canvas of dawning horror. Mrs. Becca Jonathan, said his voice dangerously even, I have been made aware of your conduct on this flight. I understand you are a platinum member, and your husband is diamond. Your family flies with us frequently. You spend a great deal of money with my airline. He took a step closer. Let me be unequivocally clear. We don't want your money. Aurowings is not a bus service for the entitled. It is a community of travelers, and you have violated the basic principles of that community. You bullied a child. You created a hostile environment for other passengers, and you instigated a situation that led to the termination of 2 of my employees. He gestured to Mr. Finch, the VP. Mr. Finch will be processing a full refund for your tickets on this flight. He will also be revoking your A+ reward status and that of your husband permanently. Furthermore, you and your immediate family are now placed on our no-fly list. You are banned from Aurowings for life. Carol Becker's jaw dropped. You can't do that. I'll sue. I'll go to the press. Jonathan Davenport gave a humorless smile. Go right ahead. Please tell them the story. Tell them how you demanded a 9-year-old girl give up her seat and then watched as my crew enforced your petty discriminatory demand. I'm sure that will go over wonderfully for you. He then looked down at Kevin, who was staring at his mother's crumbling facade with wide, confused eyes. And you, Jonathan, said his voice softening slightly, but losing none of its authority. Son, a window seat is a privilege, not a right. Kindness is more important than altitude. I hope you remember that. He turned his back on them. The matter concluded. The karma had been delivered, swift, brutal, and perfectly proportional to the offense. Lavanya Zadeh, he said, his warm, familial tone returning. Let's go home. As they walked toward the front of the plane, passing the other stunned passengers, Jonathan paused and addressed them all. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Jonathan Davenport, the CEO of Aurowings. I sincerely apologize for the delay and for you having to witness this incident. The behavior you saw today is not what this airline stands for. We will do better. Thank you for your patience. He then led his family off the plane, leaving behind a cabin filled with the wreckage of 2 careers, 1 lifetime travel ban, and a powerful, unforgettable lesson in accountability. The harsh fluorescent light of the airport was replaced by the soft, buttery leather of a private car waiting for them on the tarmac. The door closed, sealing them in a quiet bubble, a world away from the drama that had just unfolded. Zadeh, exhausted but safe between her father and her aunt, quickly fell asleep, her head resting on Lavanya's lap. Jonathan watched his daughter for a long moment, a complex mix of fury and relief on his face. He finally looked at Lavanya, his voice low and heavy. I can't thank you enough, Lavanya, not just for looking after her, but for how you handled that, your restraint, your precision. I was listening to the captain's report on the way over. You were surgical. I just wanted to protect her, Lavanya said, stroking Zaid's hair. But Jonathan, she asked me if it was because she was brown. That's what this was really about. Carol Becker saw a little black girl and assumed she was an easy target, that she didn't belong in that seat. And your crew, they made the same assumption. They saw me, they saw her, and they sided with the blonde woman in the expensive pantsuit. The name Davenport shouldn't have mattered. Jonathan nodded his jaw tight. You're right. It shouldn't have. And that's the part that's eating me alive. This isn't just about firing 2 employees and banning 1 passenger. That's the easy part. That's just cutting out the most obvious part of the tumor. But what about the rest of the disease? He leaned his head back against the seat, looking weary. This has exposed something rotten in our culture. A bias, a weakness, a willingness to take the path of least resistance, which always ends up hurting the people with the least perceived power. When they arrived at Lavenia's parents' house in Sausalito, the grandparents swept Zadeh up in loving hugs, completely unaware of the ordeal she had just endured. Lavenia and Jonathan let them have their joyful reunion, watching from the doorway. Later that evening, after Zadeh was tucked into bed, Jonathan sat on the back deck with Lavenia, looking out at the twinkling lights of the city across the bay. He had been on his phone for hours, speaking in low, urgent tones with his executive team. "We're grounding the entire in-flight staff of the Chicago hub for 2 days next week," he said, finally putting his phone down. "Mandatory top-to-bottom retraining on de-escalation, implicit bias, and cultural sensitivity. It's going to cost us millions in cancellations and rescheduling, but I don't care. We're ripping out the old training manual and starting over. The Susan Peters case study will be lesson number 1. He continued, "We're also changing policy. From now on, any seating dispute involving a minor will require the purser and captain to be directly consulted before any passenger is asked to move. No exceptions. And our complaint system is being overhauled. We're creating a new Office of Passenger Advocacy, completely independent from in-flight services, that will report directly to my office." He wasn't just cleaning house. He was redesigning the entire foundation. The incident had become a catalyst, a painful but necessary trigger for a profound institutional change. The story of Flight 715 would become a legend within Aurowings, a cautionary tale that reminded every single employee that every passenger mattered and that a person's true status had nothing to do with their frequent flyer tier. The next morning, Jonathan sat with Zadeh on that same deck, eating pancakes her grandmother had made. "Zozo," he said gently, "I want you to know that what happened on the plane yesterday was wrong. It was not your fault. You did nothing wrong. That woman and the flight attendants, they were wrong. And we don't ever let people who are wrong make us feel small." Zadeh nodded, looking down at her plate. Auntie Lavenia said it was because they were rude. They were, Jonathan agreed. Very rude. But it's more than that. Sometimes people who look like us have to be a little stronger, a little braver, because the world isn't always fair. But you have a voice. Auntie Lavenia used her voice for you yesterday, and I will always use my voice for you. I need you to promise me that you will always use your voice for yourself too, and for others who might not be able to. Promise? She looked up at him, her eyes clear and serious. "I promise, Daddy." A month later, Lavenia and Zadeh were back at an airport, this time flying home. They were, of course, flying Aurowings. As they boarded the gate, Agent smiled warmly. The new flight crew greeted them with genuine respect. When they got to their seats, 12A and 12B, Zadeh paused. She looked at the window, then back at the aisle. She looked at her aunt. "Auntie Lavenia." "Yes, sweet pea. You take the window this time." Lavenia smiled, her heart full. "Are you sure?" "Yes," Zadeh said, scrambling into the aisle seat and buckling herself in with a newfound confidence. "I've seen it already. It's your turn to be a superhero." Lavenia settled into the window seat, but as the plane pushed back from the gate, she wasn't looking at the ground falling away. She was looking at the remarkable, resilient, and incredibly strong little girl beside her. A girl who had faced down the casual ugliness of the world and had come out the other side not smaller, but stronger. The karma of Flight 715 hadn't just been about punishment. It had been about purification. And its most important result was sitting right here, ready for her next adventure. The story of Zadeh Davenport is a powerful reminder that the fight against injustice isn't always loud and explosive. Sometimes it's a quiet, firm no. It's the calm collection of facts in the face of intimidation. Dr. Lavenia Washington didn't scream or shout. She used her intelligence and resolve to turn a moment of humiliation into a catalyst for sweeping change. This incident serves as a stark lesson for corporations everywhere. Your culture is defined not by the mission statement on the wall, but by how your employees treat the most vulnerable person in the room. What started as an act of petty racism on Flight 715 ended in a complete corporate overhaul, proving that one person armed with the truth can indeed move mountains, or in this case, an entire airline. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more true life stories of karma and justice. Thank you for listening.